Monica Davis tightened her grip on her son's hand, her heart pounding as she pushed through the heavy glass doors of City View Medical Center. The sterile scent of disinfectant hit her immediately, but all Monica could focus on was the sharp, ragged breaths coming from Jamal, her 10-year-old son. His chest rose and fell too fast, his eyes wide with panic as he struggled to breathe. "Just hold on, baby," Monica whispered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Her voice was calm for his sake, but inside fear churned like a storm. She had rushed him here the second his breathing worsened, throwing on her coat and running out the door without even locking it. They reached the reception desk where a middle-aged white nurse with cold blue eyes and a tight bun stood, arms crossed. Her name tag read Linda Carlson, and the way her gaze swept over Monica and Jamal, sharp and judgmental, made Monica's stomach twist. "Help me, please," Monica said, breathless but steady. "My son's having trouble breathing. He needs to see a doctor right away." Linda barely blinked. She leaned against the desk, one eyebrow arching as if she'd heard this 100 times before. "What's the emergency?" she asked, her tone clipped and dismissive. Monica gestured toward Jamal, who was clutching his chest. "He's asthmatic. He's been wheezing all afternoon, but now it's worse. He can barely breathe." Linda sighed dramatically, flipping through some papers without even looking at Jamal. "The waiting room's full," she said. "You'll have to sit down and wait your turn." Monica stared at her in disbelief. "He can't wait. Look at him, he's struggling to breathe." Linda glanced at Jamal, then shrugged. "He doesn't look that bad to me. We get a lot of people exaggerating symptoms to jump the line. You'll have to wait." The words hit Monica like a slap. Her eyes darted around the room. Several other patients were seated, some with mild coughs, others scrolling through their phones. None of them looked nearly as urgent as Jamal. "I just saw you admit that man without making him wait," Monica said, pointing at a man who had walked in moments before them. "Why does my son have to wait?" Linda's lips curled into a faint, smug smile. "He's a scheduled patient. Besides, it's not my fault people like you always wait until the last minute to come in. Maybe if you'd been more responsible, he wouldn't be in this situation." Monica felt her pulse spike. People like me? What did she mean by that? Her mind raced, torn between outrage and panic for her son. Jamal let out a sharp wheeze, his tiny shoulders heaving as he gasped for air. "I'm not asking for a favor," Monica said, her voice rising. "I'm demanding that my son get the care he needs, now." Linda leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I'm not the one you want to mess with, honey," she said through gritted teeth. "Security's right over there. Cause a scene and you'll be escorted out." Tears stung Monica's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of this woman. Her son's life was at stake. In the corner of the room, Monica noticed Dr. Patel, a tall, calm-looking doctor with a clipboard in his hand. He glanced at the commotion but kept walking toward another patient, his brow furrowing slightly as he glanced back at Jamal. The tension in the room thickened as Linda smirked again. "Take a seat," she said, waving her hand dismissively toward the waiting area. "We'll call you if it gets worse." Monica's chest burned with frustration. "It is worse," she snapped, her voice trembling with desperation. "Can't you see that? He's gasping for air." Several patients turned to watch the exchange, their curious eyes bouncing between Monica and Linda. Some looked concerned, others intrigued, but no one said a word. Jamal's breathing grew more labored, and his small frame shook with every shallow breath. Monica crouched beside him, stroking his back in slow circles. "You're okay, baby, I've got you. Just hold on a little longer," she whispered, trying to sound confident. When she looked back up, Linda was checking her watch, clearly bored. Monica's blood boiled. How could someone be so indifferent? "We need help," Monica said again, her voice cracking. "He can't wait any longer." Linda rolled her eyes. "I already told you, take a seat." Before she could finish, Monica straightened and leaned over the desk, her face inches from Linda's. If my son doesn't get help right now, I will make sure everyone in this hospital knows what you did. You won't have a job by the time I'm done." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but just then, Jamal let out a sharp, wheezing gasp. His eyes wide with terror, he clutched at Monica's jacket, his body trembling. Monica's heart lurched. "That's it," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "If you won't help him, I'll find someone who will." At that exact moment, Dr. Patel reappeared, his eyes locking onto Jamal. His calm demeanor evaporated as he rushed over. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking at Linda before turning to Monica. "How long has he been like this?" Monica's voice shook. "Since we got here, she wouldn't let him in." Dr. Patel's face darkened. He crouched beside Jamal, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Take a deep breath for me, buddy," he said softly. Jamal tried, but wheezed again, tears streaming down his cheeks. Dr. Patel stood, his jaw tight. "This child needs immediate treatment. Code red now." The waiting room erupted into chaos as nurses and orderlies rushed to respond. Linda froze, her face losing its smugness. Dr. Patel turned to Linda, his eyes blazing. Why wasn't he admitted the moment he walked in? Linda stammered, her eyes darting around for an escape. I thought it wasn't that serious. You thought wrong, Dr. Patel snapped. This could have been fatal. Monica watched as they wheeled Jamal into a treatment room, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and relief. The room seemed to spin around her as the weight of everything settled in. She turned to Dr. Patel, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, clutching her bag. "Thank you for listening." Dr. Patel nodded, his expression softening. "We'll take care of him, I promise." As Monica stood frozen in the doorway of the treatment room, watching the nurses work swiftly around Jamal, flashes of her past began to resurface, moments she had fought to forget, moments that felt far too similar to what had just unfolded. This wasn't the first time Monica had been dismissed or ignored when she needed help the most. She grew up in Clarksdale, Mississippi, a town that carried the weight of history on its streets. Her mother, Evelyn, had always warned her about the subtle ways the world would try to push her down, not always with outright insults, but with those sly, insidious slights that stung just as deeply. "Baby," Evelyn would say, holding her chin up with fierce pride. "They'll look at your skin and think they know your story. They'll assume you're less smart, less capable, less worthy. But you never let them make you feel small. Never." Monica had clung to those words through every challenge. In college, when a professor suggested she might not be cut out for the program, despite her top grades. At her first job, where her ideas were ignored until a white colleague repeated them and was instantly praised. And now here, in a hospital where the stakes weren't just about dignity, they were about life and death. Her thoughts snapped back to the present as she heard the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and Jamal's labored breathing. Dr. Patel's calm voice broke through the fog. "His oxygen levels are low," he said to the nurse beside him. "Let's start him on a nebulizer treatment and monitor his response." Monica exhaled, gripping the edge of the doorway for support. Relief flickered in her chest, but it was fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. She prayed silently that Jamal's breathing would stabilize. As the treatment began, Dr. Patel glanced back at Monica. "He's going to be okay," he assured her. "You got him here just in time." Monica nodded, though her throat felt tight. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. But her relief was short-lived. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable click of heels on the tile floor. "Linda." Monica turned slowly, meeting the nurse's eyes. Linda's smugness had faded, replaced by a mask of forced professionalism. She crossed her arms, her lips tightening into a thin line. "I didn't know he was that bad," Linda muttered, her eyes darting between Monica and Dr. Patel. Monica's hands curled into fists at her sides. "You didn't care enough to find out," she said, her voice low but trembling with barely restrained anger. Dr. Patel's gaze sharpened. He turned fully to Linda, his expression unreadable but cold. "You're a triage nurse," he said, his tone calm but cutting. "It's your job to assess patients accurately and prioritize care. Ignoring obvious distress is not a mistake we can afford to make." Linda's face flushed a deep red. I've been under a lot of pressure today," she stammered. "It won't happen again." Monica's eyes never left her. "Pressure doesn't give you an excuse to treat my son or anyone like they don't matter. I've seen people like you my entire life. You assume you know who we are the second you see us. You assumed we didn't deserve immediate help, and that assumption could have cost my son his life." The room fell silent. Even the nurses had paused, their eyes flicking between Monica and Linda. Dr. Patel cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Linda, step out for a moment. We'll discuss this later." Linda hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly at Monica before turning on her heel and leaving the room. Monica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands shook, but she refused to let the weight of the moment crush her. Not here, not now. Nothing overthinking, not supreme effort, not for this. Dr. Patel touched her arm gently, drawing her attention back to him. "Your son will be monitored for the next hour or so," he said. "If everything goes well, he should be able to go home later tonight. You did the right thing bringing him in when you did." Monica swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't shown up," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's focus on him getting better," Dr. Patel said. "But I'll make sure this situation is addressed. No one should ever be treated the way you were, especially not here." As Dr. Patel returned to Jamal's bedside, Monica sat down in the chair beside her son, brushing a hand over his forehead. His breathing had begun to slow, each breath steadier than the last. Her heart ached at the sight of him lying there hooked up to machines. He was her world, her everything. The thought of losing him was too much to bear. She glanced toward the hallway where Linda had disappeared. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but it was tempered by a new resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In that moment, Monica made a silent vow she would hold this hospital accountable, not just for what happened to Jamal, but for every patient who had been ignored, dismissed, or mistreated because someone like Linda decided they didn't look urgent enough. No mother, no one, should ever have to fight for their child's life in the very place meant to protect it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle tug on her sleeve. Jamal's eyes fluttered open, his breathing still labored but better than before. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm right here, baby," Monica said, leaning closer. "You're okay now. The doctors are taking care of you." Jamal's tiny hand curled around hers, and despite the chaos, the fear, and the anger still swirling inside her, Monica smiled. "You're so strong," she whispered. "You've always been my little fighter." And as she sat there, holding his hand, Monica knew that this fight wasn't just for him. It was for every mother, every patient, every person who had been told they didn't belong or didn't deserve care. This was just the beginning. Monica watched over Jamal as he rested, her fingers gently stroking his curls. His breathing had evened out, and the machines around him no longer blared their ominous alarms. Relief flooded her heart, but it was fleeting, a quiet whisper beneath a roaring tide of indignation. This wasn't just about her son. It was about something much larger, something that had taken root deep inside these walls, growing unnoticed and unchecked for far too long. She glanced toward the hallway, her eyes narrowing as she thought of Linda. How many others had she turned away with that same dismissive smirk? How many patients had walked out, untreated, because they didn't fit her biased perception of who deserved urgent care? Her jaw tightened. Enough was enough. Determined, Monica reached for her phone. She opened her notes app and began documenting every detail of what had happened, from the moment Linda refused to triage Jamal to Dr. Patel's intervention, Dates, times, exact words, she captured it all. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she added a final note. This is not an isolated incident. When Dr. Patel returned to check on Jamal, Monica looked up, her expression calm but resolute. "Dr. Patel, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, keeping her voice measured. "Of course," he said, gesturing for her to step outside with him. In the hallway, Monica crossed her arms, locking eyes with him. "I appreciate everything you've done for Jamal," she began. "But what happened earlier is unacceptable. My son could have died because a nurse made assumptions instead of doing her job. I can't let this go without accountability." Dr. Patel nodded slowly, his brow furrowing. "You're right," he said. "What you experienced shouldn't happen to anyone. I'll be filing an incident report, and there will be an internal review." Monica appreciated his words, but she had lived through enough broken promises to know how often these things were swept under the rug. "I'm grateful for that," she said, her tone steady. "But I want to make sure this isn't buried in paperwork. This isn't just about me. It's about how patients are treated in this hospital, especially patients who look like me." Dr. Patel's gaze softened with understanding. "I'll make sure it's taken seriously," he promised. "But I also encourage you to file a formal complaint with hospital administration. The more voices we have, the harder it will be for them to ignore." Monica nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just going to file a complaint. She was going to make sure her voice echoed through every hallway in this building. The next morning, Monica stood in front of the Patient Advocacy Office, a modest room tucked away on the third floor. A plaque on the wall read, "We're here to listen." But Monica wondered how many voices had been heard and how many had been conveniently ignored. Inside, a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard greeted her. "How can I help you?" Monica took a deep breath and handed over her meticulously written statement. "I want to file an official complaint regarding the treatment my son and I received yesterday," she said. "I also believe this is part of a larger pattern of behavior from certain staff members." The woman's eyes scanned the first few lines, her expression shifting from polite interest to concern. "I see," she said, her voice lowering. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We take complaints like this very seriously. You'll be contacted soon as we begin our investigation." Monica nodded. She could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, but she knew that words alone weren't enough. Action needed to follow. As she walked out of the office, her phone buzzed in her hand. It was her best friend, Kendra, a fierce community organizer with a knack for turning quiet complaints into unstoppable movements. "Hey, Monica," Kendra's voice crackled through the line. "What's going on?" Monica paused at the window, staring out over the hospital parking lot. "You won't believe what happened yesterday," she said, recounting every painful detail. By the time she finished, Kendra's silence was heavy on the other end. Then, finally, "Monica, this can't stay quiet. We need to get your story out there." Monica hesitated. She had always been a private person, preferring to fight her battles quietly. But this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was about Jamal, about every patient who had ever been turned away. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "It's time to shine a light on this." The next week, Monica's story began to spread. First, it was a small feature on the local news. Then, a community blog picked it up. Soon, social media was buzzing with hashtags like "Justice for Jamal" and "Equal Care for All." Parents shared their own experiences of being dismissed in hospitals, and former patients of the same facility came forward with eerily similar stories. One woman, Deidre, commented under the post, "I was turned away last year with chest pain. They said it was anxiety. Turned out it was a mild heart attack. This has to stop." Monica read every comment, her heart aching with each new revelation. The pattern was undeniable. At first, the hospital administration tried to stay silent, hoping the story would blow over. But as the days passed and the pressure mounted, they could no longer ignore the growing outcry. A press release was issued, vaguely promising a thorough investigation and commitment to fair treatment. Monica wasn't impressed. Words without action meant nothing. In the midst of the storm, Monica received a call from Dr. Patel. His voice was warm, but there was an urgency beneath his usual calm demeanor. "Monica," he said, "I thought you'd want to know. The hospital board has scheduled a public meeting. They'll be addressing the recent complaints, including yours. If you want to speak, this would be your chance." Monica's pulse quickened. A public meeting meant she wouldn't just be a name on a complaint form. She would have the chance to look these people in the eye and demand change. "I'll be there," she said firmly. As she hung up, Monica felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment she had been waiting for. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a small, determined smile. Linda, and anyone else who had ever dismissed her, dismissed people like her, were about to face the truth. The day of the hospital board meeting arrived, and Monica stood outside the hospital auditorium, her heart pounding. A cluster of reporters waited at the entrance, their cameras flashing as she made her way up the steps. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support, friends, neighbors, and even complete strangers urging her to speak her truth. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Hospital administrators sat at the long, polished table at the front of the room, their expressions a mix of concern and weariness. The board chair, a gray-haired man in a tailored suit, adjusted his glasses and tapped his microphone. "We are here today," he began, "to address the recent concerns raised by several patients and community members regarding alleged instances of discrimination within our hospital." Monica took her seat near the front, clutching her notebook filled with facts, dates, and every detail of her experience. She scanned the crowd, her eyes locking briefly with Linda, who sat stiffly in the back row, her face devoid of its usual smugness. When the floor was opened for public statements, Monica didn't hesitate. She stood, smoothing her blazer, and made her way to the podium. Her voice was steady as she began. "My name is Monica Lewis, and I'm here today not just as a mother, but as a voice for every patient who has ever been dismissed, ignored, or treated as less than because of who they are." The room fell silent, the weight of her words cutting through the tension like a knife. 2 weeks ago, I brought my son Jamal to this hospital. He was in serious distress, struggling to breathe. But instead of receiving the immediate care he needed, we were stopped at the front desk and dismissed by a nurse who assumed, based on nothing but her own bias, that we didn't belong. My son could have died because someone decided to judge him before treating him. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, their expressions turning serious. Monica continued, her voice growing stronger. "This wasn't an isolated incident. Since my story became public, dozens of other patients have come forward with similar experiences. They were turned away, misdiagnosed, or ignored, all because they didn't fit someone's preconceived idea of what a patient in need looks like." Her eyes swept the room, pausing on each member of the board. "This is a systemic problem, and it won't be solved with empty promises or carefully worded press releases. Real change requires action and accountability. It's time for this hospital to face the truth." For a moment, the room remained silent. Then one of the board members, a woman with short-cropped hair and a compassionate gaze, leaned into her microphone. "Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Your courage in sharing your experience is deeply appreciated. We're committed to addressing these concerns." Monica nodded, but she wasn't done yet. She turned to the audience, where hospital staff and community members watched with rapt attention. "It's not enough to listen. We need policies in place to protect patients from discrimination. We need transparency in how complaints are handled, and we need a culture shift, one that prioritizes every life equally." A few heads nodded in agreement. Even Dr. Patel, seated in the front row, gave her a small, encouraging smile. Suddenly, a voice from the back broke the silence. "I think it's time we hear from Nurse Linda," someone said. All eyes turned toward the back row, where Linda sat frozen. Her face paled, but she quickly regained her composure, standing and making her way to the front with forced confidence. As she reached the podium, her eyes darted nervously across the crowd. "I'd like to clarify a few things," she began, her voice shaky but defiant. "I acted according to hospital protocol. I never intended to harm anyone. If there was a misunderstanding, I apologize." Monica folded her arms, her gaze unwavering. "A misunderstanding?" she echoed. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Linda faltered, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. For the first time, the confidence she had wielded like a weapon seemed to waver. Monica stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "This isn't about protocol. It's about the assumptions you made, assumptions that nearly cost my son his life. This is about the pattern of behavior you've shown toward patients who look like me. We've seen it, and now the whole community is seeing it too." The tension in the room grew thicker. Even the board members seemed riveted, leaning in to catch every word. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice rose from the audience. It was Deirdre, the woman who had commented online about her own experience. She stood, her eyes blazing with determination. "She's right," Deirdre said, her voice trembling but strong. "I was turned away last year. They told me it was anxiety, but it was a heart attack. This hospital needs to be better." Another woman stood, followed by a young man with his arm in a sling. One by one, patients shared their stories, each one a testament to the deep-rooted problem that had gone unchecked for far too long. Linda shrank back, her composure crumbling under the weight of their testimonies. The board chair raised a hand to restore order, his expression grim. "Thank you for sharing your experiences. This is clearly a serious issue that demands immediate action." He turned to Monica, his eyes filled with a mix of respect and regret. "Ms. Lewis, you've made it clear that we have a lot of work to do. We'll be conducting a full investigation and taking the necessary steps to ensure this never happens again." Monica nodded, a surge of relief washing over her. But she knew this was just the beginning. Words were powerful, but they needed to be backed by action. As the meeting adjourned, several people approached Monica, thanking her for her bravery. Dr. Patel pulled her aside, his voice low. "You did it," he said. "You're making a difference." Monica smiled, but her eyes were determined. "We did it," she corrected. "And we're just getting started." The day after the board meeting, the hospital's investigation began in full swing. An independent team of auditors and legal consultants were brought in to review patient complaints and interview staff. The air inside the hospital felt heavy, as if the walls themselves held secrets that were finally being dragged into the light. Nurses whispered nervously in the hallways, while doctors avoided eye contact as they rushed past Monica in the waiting area. The first official step was reviewing recorded security footage from the night Monica brought Jamal to the hospital. Monica sat with Dr. Patel and the investigators in a small, sterile office as they watched the grainy black and white footage play on a monitor. There it was. The moment captured in full. Monica rushing into the emergency room, clutching her son's hand, and being stopped cold by Linda at the front desk. The footage didn't have audio, but the body language was undeniable. Monica pointed urgently toward Jamal, clearly trying to explain the emergency. Linda, standing with her arms crossed, barely glanced at Jamal before shaking her head dismissively and pointing toward the waiting area. Jamal doubled over in visible distress, clutching his chest, while Linda turned her back on them and walked away. A gasp escaped from one of the auditors. How did no one escalate this situation?" Monica leaned forward, her eyes locked on the screen. Even though she had lived this moment, seeing it again made her stomach twist in knots, her fists clenched in her lap. "It wasn't protocol that failed here," Dr. Patel said quietly. "It was basic human decency." The lead investigator nodded gravely. "We'll be adding this to our report. There's no excuse for what we've just witnessed." As the days went by, the investigation unearthed even more troubling details. Former patients came forward to provide sworn statements. many of whom had never reported their mistreatment out of fear or hopelessness. A pattern began to emerge. Most of those affected were from marginalized communities. Some had been misdiagnosed, others turned away entirely without proper evaluation. Monica found herself both heartbroken and enraged as she read through the growing stack of testimonies. An elderly black woman shared how she had been left in the waiting room for hours with a fractured wrist because staff assumed she was exaggerating her pain. A single mother recalled being told to go home and sleep it off when she had come in with pneumonia. Each story was another dagger to Monica's heart, but it also fueled her determination to see justice through. Then came the bombshell. One afternoon, Dr. Patel knocked on Monica's door holding a manila folder. His expression was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You're going to want to sit down for this," he said. Monica took a seat, bracing herself. Dr. Patel handed her the folder, and as she flipped through the pages, her eyes widened in shock. It was a collection of internal emails exchanged between key hospital staff members, including Linda. The language was coded but unmistakable, references to problematic patients and flagging frequent flyers, many of whom were later identified as patients of color. One email from Linda stood out like a beacon of malice. "We need to start being stricter about who gets through these doors. Not everyone deserves our resources." Monica's hand trembled as she read the words. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just negligence or poor judgment, this was targeted discrimination. "We found this during a server sweep," Dr. Patel said quietly. "It confirms what we feared. There was a deliberate effort to filter patients based on bias." Monica's eyes blazed with fury. This is what's been happening all along. They've been picking and choosing who gets to live and who gets ignored." Dr. Patel nodded solemnly. "I've already shared this with the investigative team. Linda and others implicated in these emails will be suspended pending further disciplinary action, and this report will be sent to the state medical board for review." Monica felt the weight of the revelation settle on her shoulders, heavy but not crushing. For so long the injustice had been hidden in whispers and assumptions, but now the truth was out in the open, and there was no turning back. Later that evening, Monica sat at her kitchen table, staring at the pages spread before her. Jamal sat across from her, working on his homework, his breathing steady and even, a far cry from the panicked gasps of that terrifying night. He looked up and caught her gaze. "Mom, are you okay?" Monica smiled softly. "I am now," she said, "because they're finally listening, and they're finally going to make it right." The hospital's CEO held a press conference the next day. Cameras flashed as reporters jostled for position, eager to get the latest update on what had become a high-profile case. Monica stood in the crowd, her arms crossed, as the CEO stepped up to the microphone. "Good afternoon," he began, his tone measured. "First, I want to personally apologize to Ms. Monica Lewis and her son Jamal for the unacceptable treatment they received in our hospital. What happened was wrong, plain and simple. We have failed to meet the standards of care and respect that every patient deserves, and for that, we are deeply sorry." He paused, glancing down at his notes before continuing. "As part of our response, we are implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, creating an independent oversight committee to handle patient complaints, and partnering with local community organizations to rebuild trust. We are also cooperating fully with the state investigation into this matter." Monica raised an eyebrow. It was a good start, but she wasn't about to let them off the hook just yet. After the press conference, several reporters swarmed around her, shoving microphones into her face. "Ms. Lewis, do you feel the hospital's response is enough? Do you think justice has been served?" Monica took a deep breath. "Justice isn't a press release or a public apology," she said firmly. "Justice is making sure this never happens again, to my son or to anyone else. It's about changing the system, not just patching it up when people start paying attention. I'll keep fighting until that change is real." The press conference sparked a wildfire of public reaction. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Justice for Jamal" and "Healthcare Equality," amplifying Monica's story to national prominence. Support poured in from all corners of the country, messages from mothers who had experienced similar bias in hospitals, doctors calling for reform, and civil rights organizations offering their backing. Monica felt overwhelmed but emboldened by the outcry. Within days, community leaders organized a town hall at the local community center. Monica stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding as she looked out at the packed crowd. Familiar faces filled the seats: neighbors, teachers from Jamal's school, clergy members, and even strangers who had been moved by her story. "Good evening, everyone," Monica began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I'm here today not just for my son Jamal, but for every family that's been turned away, overlooked, or ignored because of who they are. What happened to us was a painful reminder that healthcare isn't always fair, but we have the power to change that." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. A young mother stood up, clutching her toddler close. "I took my baby to that same ER last year," she said, her voice trembling. "They told me she just had a fever and sent us home. By the next morning she was in the ICU with a severe infection. If I hadn't gone back, I don't want to think about what could have happened." Monica's chest tightened. The pain in the mother's voice mirrored her own. A pastor from a nearby church rose to speak next. "We've heard these stories for too long," he said, his deep voice resonating through the room. "But this time, we won't be silent. We stand with you, Monica, and we demand change, not just for our community, but for every community across this country." The room erupted into applause, the energy palpable. For the first time since that terrible night in the emergency room, Monica felt something shift. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to all of them. The next step was to turn their momentum into action. Monica, along with community leaders and civil rights advocates, drafted a petition calling for sweeping reforms at the hospital. They demanded mandatory bias training, a transparent patient complaint system, and an independent board to oversee hospital practices. The petition gained over 200,000 signatures in just 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the hospital's internal investigation continued, and more disturbing truths came to light. It wasn't just Linda. Several staff members had been complicit in discriminatory practices, turning a blind eye to patient suffering or perpetuating harmful biases. The state medical board launched its own inquiry, vowing to hold those responsible accountable. Monica was relentless. She attended every hearing, met with policymakers, and worked closely with local media to ensure the issue remained in the public eye. Each time she spoke, her words resonated deeply with those who had felt powerless for too long. "We're not asking for special treatment," she told a local news anchor. "We're asking for fairness, for dignity, and for the right to be treated like any other patient who walks through those doors." Her voice, once a lone cry for help, had become a rallying call for justice. A turning point came when Dr. Patel invited Monica to speak at a hospital board meeting. It was an extraordinary move, one rarely extended to a patient's family, but Dr. Patel knew that the board needed to hear Monica's story firsthand. The boardroom was a stark contrast to the lively town hall, silent, tense, and formal. Board members sat around a long table, their expressions guarded as Monica stood at the podium. She took a deep breath, grounding herself. "My name is Monica Lewis," she began. "Some of you may know me as the mother who raised concerns about the way my son was treated here. But I'm not just here to talk about my son. I'm here to talk about every patient who has been judged, dismissed, and ignored simply because of the color of their skin." Several board members shifted uncomfortably, but Monica pressed on. "The footage from that night speaks for itself. The emails you've seen, those weren't isolated incidents. This is a systemic problem, and if we don't fix it, more families will suffer. More children like Jamal will be put at risk. And that's not something I'm willing to accept." Dr. Patel nodded in support from the corner of the room. "We can do better," he said, turning to the board. "And we must do better." The board members sat in stunned silence for a moment before the chairperson finally spoke. "Thank you, Miss Lewis. We've heard you loud and clear." For the first time in weeks, Monica felt a glimmer of real hope. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. The hospital, once unwilling to admit any wrongdoing, announced sweeping reforms. A press release confirmed that Linda and several other staff members involved in the incident had been terminated, while a new department dedicated to patient advocacy and equitable treatment was being established. The hospital board vowed to implement mandatory bias training for all employees and to partner with local civil rights groups to ensure oversight and accountability. Monica stood in front of the hospital steps, watching the news unfold. Camera crews from several networks swarmed around her, microphones extended, waiting for her statement. She clutched a prepared note in her hand, but she didn't need it. The words had been with her for weeks, burning inside her. "My fight wasn't just for my son Jamal," she began, her voice steady despite the flashing cameras. "It was for every parent who's begged for help and been ignored, every family that's been judged before they were treated, and every patient who's been told they don't matter. This is a step in the right direction, but the fight doesn't end here." The crowd listened in silence, many wiping away tears. Monica paused, scanning the sea of faces, and then raised her hand to gesture toward the hospital behind her. "This place is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where people find healing, not judgment, not bias, and certainly not discrimination. Today, we've taken the first step toward making that a reality." The audience erupted in applause. Beside her, Jamal gripped her hand tightly. He had grown stronger through the ordeal, no longer the scared boy who had been turned away at the ER. He looked up at his mother with pride, admiration shining in his eyes. Later that evening, Monica sat with Jamal on their living room couch. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the television the only sound in the background. She wrapped an arm around his shoulder, holding him close. "You were so brave," she whispered. Jamal smiled softly. "You were braver, Mom." Monica chuckled, but her eyes welled with tears. The weight of what they had endured finally hit her. This wasn't just a victory for her and Jamal. It was a victory for countless others who had been silenced for too long. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Monica opened the door to find Dr. Patel standing on the porch, a warm smile on his face. "I just wanted to stop by and personally thank you," he said. "You've changed things here, Monica. I know it wasn't easy, but what you did, what you're still doing, has made a difference." Monica nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Patel, for listening and standing by us when it mattered most." As Dr. Patel walked away, Monica felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The road ahead would still be challenging, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. In the days that followed, Monica's story continued to inspire. Community leaders praised her courage. Advocacy groups began using her case as a model for challenging healthcare inequality. Even national media picked up the story, spotlighting her as a force for change. A year later, Monica returned to the hospital, this time for an entirely different reason. A ceremony in honor of the hospital's new Monica Lewis Patient Advocacy Center, dedicated to ensuring that no patient would ever again face the same bias and discrimination she and Jamal had endured. Standing before the crowd, Monica spoke from the heart. "This isn't just a building," she said. "It's a promise that every voice matters, that every patient will be treated with dignity, and that change is always possible if we're brave enough to fight for it." As she left the hospital that day, Jamal by her side, Monica reflected on how far they had come. Life had tested them in unimaginable ways, but they had emerged stronger, their voices louder, their purpose clearer. The fight for justice never truly ended. But for Monica, one thing was certain. She and Jamal were ready for whatever came next, and this time, they would face it together. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Black Inspiring Stories for more powerful narratives that shed light on inequality, resilience, and triumph. Join the conversation and help us continue to spread these important messages.